Hi grade 7s. We're gonna do a refugee lesson for today. So I thought we would start off with going through a bit of a roundup about what we read when we were last together, and then we're gonna move on to some prediction questions and the new chapters. If you do have your refugee novel at home, unfortunately I don't, so I'm using my iPad right now, so I can't tell you exactly what page it is, but it's chapter 46 that we will be starting today. So if you can go back and count, I believe it's in the late 100s range, but I can't really tell you much more than that, unfortunately, for you guys. I will repost the link if you would like to read along online for the free PDF while I read off my iPad. I'll post that again just in case anybody missed it, okay? So to start off, what we read last for Joseph first, his father was left behind in Cuba. He was kept in that hospital after he jumped off the boat in an attempt to commit suicide because he was so afraid of going back to Germany and being put back in a camp. So Captain Schroeder decided that they were going to cut their losses in Cuba. They were going to try to get into the United States with the president there, FDR, President Roosevelt, and that did not go well either. They were not able to bring the MS St. Louis to America and unload the Jewish people there for safety. So a group of older men approached Joseph with a scheme to take some of the crew hostage so that they could essentially use them to gain access into the United States. So because Joseph had previously been brought up to the bridge and given a tour, they thought that he would be the best person to lead them on this. And Joseph, he's now a man, he's gone through his bar mitzvah. He thought that this was a good way to be strong and be a leader and be involved and try to protect his mom and his sister. So they stormed the bridge. They were not successful though. The crew refused to listen to them. Captain Schroeder ended up walking right into the bridge to find out what was going on. But Captain Schroeder did make a promise that essentially talked all of the men off the ledge, saying that he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that they did not go back to Germany. So that's where we left off for Joseph's chapter. For Isabel's chapter, they're slowly, finally approaching Miami after getting diverted to the Bahamas. And they are in the dead of night, and two big things have happened. First of all, Isabel's mom has said that she's officially gone into labor, so the baby is coming, and the hope is that they'll get to Miami and that baby will be born on American soil and they'll be an American citizen. On top of that, they've run into some Coast Guard ships. So the Coast Guard ships have spotted a different boat, and Isabel's group has decided that they're going to paddle incredibly hard and they're going to make it no matter what. But just as they think that they've escaped the one Coast Guard ship with the lights and the sirens, another one appears to kind of train their lights onto them, and Isabel's left at the end of her chapter wondering if they're going to be able to outrow this Coast Guard ship to the shores of Miami. Because remember, it's wet foot, dry foot. So if they are caught in the water, they are automatically returned to Cuba. If they are caught on land, they are allowed to claim refugee status or asylum. All right. And then moving on lastly to Mahmoud. His family, they got through Greece, they got through Macedonia, they got through Serbia, they were held at gunpoint at the border, and they were taken for 300 euros. So they finally get to the Hungarian border, and eventually they are looking to Austria, and then Germany is the final goal. So they get to the border of Hungary, and it's starting to be fenced over, and there's guards in the way. So they attempt to kind of rush it with some of the other refugees, and they're all detained. Everybody in the family is arrested, they're pepper sprayed, they're thrown into the back of vans, and they're kept kind of in like a detention center. So Mahmoud is left with his father. They don't know where Walid and his mother are at this time, and then they're eventually let out of their cell. They finally see the mom and Walid again. They're at least safe. They're all in the same building, but they are being removed from the Hungarian border and they're being forced to go back to Serbia, which essentially now means they have to find an entirely new way to get to Austria. So the Hungarians are processing them, saying that they can't stay in Hungary, and Mahmoud's father gets very upset. He is upset that they were treated that way. He would never want to stay in a country like that anyways. And then we're left with a really awkward position at the end of the chapter where Mahmoud is kind of left to answer all these questions on behalf of his father, and similar to Joseph, kind of take on a more adult role in dealing with what's going to happen to them next in this detention center. Okay, so 3 questions for predictions to keep in mind while we read is, number 1 for Joseph, do you think the captain will keep his promise to Joseph and the other men or not? Also maybe think about, Cuba's been a no, the US has been a no. Where else do you think would be a safe place for the MS St. Louis to drop off all of these Jewish refugees? Number 2, do you think Isabel's boat will make it to the shore on time? Just an opinion. Are they going to be able to outrow a Coast Guard boat with a motor and everything, or not? And then third, just based on the fact that Mahmoud's father has appeared to shut down at the end of chapter 45, what role do you think Mahmoud will have to take on after their experience in Hungary? Keeping in mind that Mahmoud at the beginning of our novel was invisible. Remember, that was his main focus. He was trying to really stay under the radar, stay out of trouble. He's now been put into multiple circumstances where he can't do that anymore. So do you think he's going to retreat back into the invisibility? Or do you think that he's going to continue to kind of grow out of the shell we saw at the very beginning? All right, so those are the 3 questions to keep in mind. I'm going to start reading. And again, if you can follow along, great. If you can follow along with the link, or if you didn't listen to me and you brought your novel home anyways, good for you in hindsight. So you can follow along if you find the right chapter. Alrighty? So, chapter 46, we have Joseph. The St. Louis was throwing a party, even bigger than the one it had thrown the night before they'd reached Cuba. This one had the euphoria of more than 900 people who had been at death's door and were suddenly, miraculously saved. Belgium, Holland, France, and England had agreed to divide the refugees among them. None of the passengers were going back to Germany. Joseph's mother wasn't alone on the dance floor anymore. She was joined by dozens of couples, all dancing with giddy abandon. Joseph had even taken a turn around the floor with her. Passengers sang songs and played the piano with the orchestra, and one man who knew magic tricks entertained Ruthie and the other little kids in the corner of the social hall. In another corner, Joseph laughed as passengers took turns telling jokes. Many of the jokes were about taking holiday cruises to Cuba, but the best was when one of the passengers got up and read from the brochure that advertised the MS St. Louis. The St. Louis is a ship on which everyone travels securely and lives in comfort, he read. You could barely hear him over the hooting. There is everything one can wish for, the man read, gasping for breath. That makes life on board a pleasure. We hope you'll want to travel on the St. Louis again and again. Joseph laughed so hard he cried. If he never saw the MS St. Louis again in his life, he would die happy. The next morning, the ship docked at a pier in Antwerp, Belgium. Negotiations between Captain Schroeder and the 4 countries still took time, and it was a full day later when, under the grim portrait of Adolf Hitler, Joseph and his family joined the other passengers in the social hall, again to find out where they would be going. Representatives from the 4 countries sat at a long table at the front of the hall, arguing over which passengers each would take. Every country wanted only the passengers with the best chances of getting accepted by America so they could ship the refugees back out as quickly as possible. Joseph hoped they would get England because it was the farthest away from Nazi Germany, safest across the English Channel. But when everything was settled, he and his family were assigned to France. They would be among the 3rd group to disembark, after the Jewish refugees going to Belgium and the Netherlands were delivered, but before the last group sailed for Great Britain. The first group left that afternoon. Joseph watched with most of the other passengers as the refugees going to Belgium disembarked. Joseph didn't want to go to Belgium, but he was jealous nonetheless. Like everyone else, he was ready to get off this ship. Think of it. We traveled 10,000 miles on board the St. Louis, one of the men leaving for Belgium told the other passengers as he stepped onto the gangplank, only to end up 300 miles from where we started. The line got a laugh, but a sad one. Joseph was all too aware of the long shadow cast by Nazi Germany, and so was everyone else. Still, as long as the Nazis stayed in Germany, they would all be safe, wouldn't they? The next day, 181 passengers disembarked in the city of Rotterdam, even though Holland wouldn't let the St. Louis dock at their pier, just like in Havana. The refugees were taken into town by another ship and escorted by police boats. As they sailed on to France, Joseph wandered the decks. The ship had a strange, empty feeling to it. Half the passengers were gone. The morning they arrived in Boulogne, France, the 288 passengers who were traveling on to England had gathered on sea deck to say farewell to Joseph and the others who were disembarking. "We're due into England tomorrow," Joseph heard one of them say. "June 21st. That's exactly 40 days and 40 nights in a boat. Now where have I heard that story before?" Joseph smiled, remembering the story of Noah from the Torah, but he felt less like Noah and more like Moses, wandering in the desert for 40 days before reaching the promised land. Was that France? The promised land at last? Joseph could only pray it was. He picked up his suitcase in one hand, took Ruthie's hand with his other, and led her and their mother down the ramp into Boulogne. "You see," Mama said, "I told you somebody would think of something. Now stay close and don't lose your coats." At the bottom of the ramp, Joseph watched as one of the other passengers got down on his hands and knees and kissed the ground. If he hadn't had his hands full, Joseph might have done the same thing. The Secretary General of the French Refugee Assistance Committee officially welcomed them to France, and the porters on the docks moved quickly to carry the passengers' luggage for them, refusing any and all tips offered. Maybe this was the promised land after all. Joseph and his mother and sister spent the night in a hotel in Boulogne, and then they were taken by train to Le Mans, where they were put up in a cheap lodging house. Days passed and life went on. Joseph's mother got work doing other people's laundry. Ruthie went to kindergarten at last, and Joseph went to school for the first time in months. But because he couldn't speak French, they put him in the first grade. 13 years old, a man, and they put him in a classroom with 7-year-olds. It was humiliating. Joseph promised himself he would learn to speak French over the summer or die trying. He never got the chance. 2 months later, Germany invaded Poland, touching off a new world war. 8 months after that, Germany invaded France, and Joseph and his mother and sister were on the run again. Okay, so you need to keep in mind that in 1939, the Germans had only been in Germany at that point. So they were slowly starting to expand throughout the rest of Europe. So Poland was the first country they did that to, and then France, and then Holland, and then Belgium. All right, so we don't know what's going to happen to Joseph next, but officially World War II has started. All right, okay, so Isabel. Isabel's mother cried out, "It's coming, it's coming." Isabel didn't know if she meant the baby or the Coast Guard ship, or both. "Paddle," Amara cried. Isabel paddled harder. She could see the shore, could see the beach umbrellas folded up for the night, but still stuck in the sand. Strings of lights, palm trees, more music, a salsa now. It was all so close. But so was the Coast Guard ship. It bore down on them, its red light flashing, its powerful motor thrumming, water sluicing from its bow. Isabel's heart hammered. It was going to catch them. They weren't going to make it. Lito freezed. "It's happening again," he said. "What? What do you mean?" Isabel asked, panting. "When I was a young man, I was a policeman," Lito said, his eyes wild. "There was a ship full of Jews from Europe, and we sent them back. I sent them back to die when we could so easily have taken them in. It was all politics, but they were people, real people. I met them, I knew them by name." "I don't understand," Isabel said. What did her grandfather's story have to do with anything? "Paddle," Isabel's father cried. The Coast Guard boat was almost on top of them. "Don't you see," Lito said? "The Jewish people on the ship were seeking asylum, just like us. They needed a place to hide from Hitler, from the Nazis. Mañana, we told them. We'll let you know mañana. But we never did." Lito was crying now, distraught. "We sent them back to Europe and Hitler and the Holocaust, back to their deaths. How many of them died because we turned them away? Because I was just doing my job." Isabel didn't know what ship her grandfather was talking about, but she knew about the Holocaust from school. The millions of European Jews who had been murdered by the Nazis. And now her grandfather was saying that a ship full of Jewish refugees had come to Cuba when he was a young man, that he had helped to send them away. Manana. Suddenly, Isabel understood why her grandfather had been whispering the word over and over again for days, why it haunted him. When would the Jews be let into Cuba? Manana. When would their boats reach America? Manana. Manana had never come for the Jewish people on that ship, Isabel realized. Would it never come for Isabel and her family either? A calm came over Lito, as though he'd come to some sort of understanding, some decision. I see it now, Chabela, all of it. The past, the present, the future. All my life, I kept waiting for things to get better, for the bright promise of mañana. But a funny thing happened while I was waiting for the world to change, Chabela. It didn't, because I didn't change it. I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. Take care of your mother and baby brother for me. Lito, what are you? Don't stop rowing for sure, Isabel's grandfather yelled to everyone else. He kissed Isabel on the cheek, surprising her, and then stood up and jumped into the ocean. Lito, Isabel cried. Lito. Papa, Isabel's mother cried. What's he doing? Isabel's grandfather popped back up a few meters away, his head appearing and disappearing in the waves. Lito, Isabel cried. Help, he cried, waving his arms at the Coast Guard ship, while at the same time swimming away from it. Help me, he yelled. He jumped in to distract them, Poppy realized. They'll come for us first, Senor Castillo said. No, he's in danger of drowning. They have to rescue him, Amara cried. This is our chance. Row, row. Tears rolled down Isabel's cheek where her grandfather had just kissed her goodbye. Lito, she cried again, reaching out for him over the waves. Don't worry about me, Chabela. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's treading water, Lito yelled back. Now row. Mañana is yours, my beautiful songbird. Go to Miami and be free. Isabel sobbed. She couldn't paddle, couldn't row, couldn't do anything but watch as the Coast Guard ship veered away from their little boat and steered toward her grandfather, went to save him and send him to Guantanamo. Back to Cuba. Okay, chapter 48, Mahmoud. They came for Mahmoud and his father again the next morning, this time to take them to a crowded refugee camp in a cold, muddy field, surrounded by a wire fence. Multicolored camping tents stood among heaps of trash and discarded clothes, and Hungarian soldiers in blue uniforms and white surgical masks guarded the entrances and exits. There was only one real building, a windowless, cinder block warehouse filled with row after row of metal cots. Mahmoud and his father found Mom and Malid among the newly arrived refugees, and they shared a tearful reunion. They were each given a blanket and a bottle of water and found cots for themselves. But when the food was delivered, they missed out. The Hungarian soldiers stood at one end of the room, tossing sandwiches into the crowd like zookeepers throwing food to the animals in a cage. And Mahmoud and his family didn't know enough to rush the tables to catch their lunch. Mahmoud expected his father to laugh it off, but he wasn't joking anymore. Instead, Dad sat on his cot, his face and arms purple and bruised, staring off into space. Getting beaten and thrown into prison by the Hungarians had finally broken his spirit. It scared Mahmoud. Of the 4 members of his family who were left, he was the only one who wasn't broken. His mother had snapped the moment she had handed her daughter away, and now she wandered the maze of mattresses and blankets in the detention center, asking people she had already asked if they had seen or heard of a baby named Hannah. Mahmoud's brother, Walid, was broken too, but unlike his mother, he had been broken piece by piece over time, like someone snapping off little bites of a chocolate bar until there was nothing left. He lay listless on a foam mattress, disinterested in the card games or soccer games the other children were playing. Whatever childless joy he had once possessed had been sucked out until there was nothing left. And now his father was dead inside too. Mahmoud fumed. Why were they even here? Why did the Hungarians care if they were just passing through? Why had they taken them all the way to the Austrian border only to throw them in a detention center? It felt personal somehow, like the whole country was conspiring to keep them from finding a real home. There were policemen with guns at every door. They were more like prisoners than refugees, and when they got out of here, it would just be to go back to Serbia, back to another country that didn't want them. After everything they had been through, they weren't going to make it to Germany after all. But Mahmoud wasn't ready to give up. He wanted life to be like it was before the war had come. He couldn't go back to Syria. Not now. Mahmoud knew that, but there was no reason they couldn't make a new life for themselves somewhere else. Start over, be happy again. And Mahmoud wanted to do whatever it took to make that happen, or at least try. But making something happen meant drawing attention, being visible, and being invisible was so much easier. It was useful too, like in Aleppo or Serbia or here in Hungary. But sometimes it was just as useful to be visible, like in Turkey and Greece. The reverse was true too, though. Being invisible had hurt them as much as being visible had. Mahmoud frowned. That was the real truth of it, wasn't it? Whether you were visible or invisible, it was all about how other people reacted to you. Good and bad things happened either way. If you were invisible, the bad people couldn't hurt you. That was true. But the good people couldn't help you either. If you stayed invisible here, did everything you were supposed to, and never made waves, you would disappear from the eyes and minds of all the good people out there who could help you get your life back. It was better to be visible, to stand up, to stand out. Mahmoud watched as a door on a nearby wall opened and a group of men and women in light blue caps and vests with the letters UN written on them came inside, escorted by some important-looking Hungarian soldiers. Mahmoud knew that the UN was the United Nations, the same group that had been helping people in the Kilis refugee camp. The UN people carried clipboards and cell phones and made notes and took pictures of the living conditions. This place was run by the Hungarians, not the UN, so Mahmoud guessed they were there to observe, to document the living conditions of the refugees. Mahmoud decided right then and there he was going to make sure the observers saw him. Mahmoud got up from his cot and walked to the door. All he had to do was push his way through and he would be outside. But a Hungarian soldier stood guard next to it. She wore a blue uniform, a red cap, and a thick black leather belt that held a nightstick and had all kinds of compartments. Over her shoulder, she carried a small automatic rifle on a strap, the barrel pointed at the gymnasium floor. The guard ignored Mahmoud. He stood right in front of her, but she looked over him, past him. Mahmoud was invisible as long as he did what he was supposed to do, and as long as he was invisible, he was safe, and she was comfortable. It was time for both of those things to change. Mahmoud took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The sound echoed loudly in the big room, and suddenly all the kids stopped playing, and all the adults looked up from their mattresses at him. It was green outside and sunny, and at first Mahmoud had to squint to see. "Hey," the guard cried. She saw him now, didn't she? The UN observers did too. "Stop. No, not allowed," the soldier said in bad Arabic. She struggled to find the right words and said something in Hungarian that Mahmoud didn't understand. She started to raise her gun at him, and then she glanced up and saw the frowns on the faces of the UN observers. Mahmoud stepped outside. The women looked around at the other guards and called out to them, as if asking what to do. Mahmoud took another step, and another, and soon he was away from the building, walking toward the road. Walid ran through the door after him, followed by the rest of the children. The Hungarian guards yelled after them, but they didn't do anything to stop them. "Mahmoud," Walid said, panting as he ran up alongside his brother. His eyes were bright and alive for the first time Mahmoud could remember. "Mahmoud, what are you doing?" "I'm not staying in that place and waiting for them to send me back to Serbia." "Come on," Mahmoud said. "We're walking to Austria." Okay, so that's the end of chapter 48. So I'm going to post below this the comprehension questions that you have to do. So there's 7 of them this time. So before I go through them, underneath this, if there are words you don't understand, just like in class, write them down, and if any of you know the answers to the definitions, you answer them. So anybody who knows what maybe euphoria means, or what the United Nations is, anything like that, respond, and then I'll go through any words that are left unanswered and go through any of the definitions for them. So for the questions that you're doing, number 1 is going to be, what is the main idea of chapter 46? Summarize what it is mostly about with key details and support with textual evidence. So main idea is not the theme. Main idea is what our chapter is mostly about. So what are the key important parts of Joseph's chapter this time? So 3-4 sentences about. Number 2, what happens to the passengers on the MS St. Louis? Where do Joseph and his family end up? And what happens soon after they land? Number 3, no matter where they go, what conflict can't Joseph and his family escape? How does it affect the family? Support with textual evidence. So you need to think about the treatment they received on the boat, the treatment they received in Cuba or in the harbor, the treatment they received trying to get into the U.S., and then the treatment that they received when the U.S. also rejected them. Okay? So that should be one general idea. Number 4, how does Isabel's story connect with Joseph's? What instance of foreshadowing hinted at the connection? So we've talked about this in class before. What connections do we think we made between the MS St. Louis, the Cuban police officers in Joseph's story, and then Isabel's grandfather? So as a reminder, foreshadowing is when the author plants breadcrumbs early in the stories to kind of hint at something happening later on. So there are particular examples of the foreshadowing in Isabel's chapter. So you need to tell me what connection was made and then one example of a foreshadowing breadcrumb. Number 5, what does Lito do in Isabel's chapter? Why do you think he does this? So that's your opinion on the second part. Number 6, how has Mahmoud's family changed? And what do you believe has caused these changes? So you need to use actual examples. So think about how mostly his parents and himself has changed. We'll lead, we haven't seen any changes yet, but that might change in the next chapter. And then number 7, what does Mahmoud realize about the idea of invisibility? What does he do as a result? And why does he do this? So that's kind of him talking about what's the pros and cons of being invisible and what are the pros and cons of being invisible, and then ultimately what decision does he make. So Mahmoud, we're seeing a lot of changes with him throughout the novel. So you need to think about essentially what path he's chosen at the end of his chapter. Okay? So that's what you need to work on today. Mr. Nangini will be posting some math for you. I believe you're starting integers. So tomorrow I'm going to post the next video and we're going to do chapters 49 to 51. Miss C comes back next Tuesday. So the goal is over the next 4 days, we're going to bang out the rest of Refugee. You'll be answering some questions. The questions are on a Word document, so you should be able to open them, type on it, and upload it to the Google Classroom. If you cannot do that, open the document, handwrite your answers, take a picture, upload that. If you can't do that, write out the whole thing under a submission, but you need to be getting work in because at this point, this is our only option, so you will be getting marked on these. And we'll probably do comprehension questions for the next couple of chapters, maybe a discussion question instead, depending on what the chapters kind of bring up. Okay, so if you have any questions about what we read or about the work, you need to post it, not tomorrow morning when you're supposed to be submitting it, later on today, please. Okay, so stay inside, stay home, and do your homework. Okay, bye guys.